we all realize by now that we live in a world that is driven by the relentless pursuit of pleasure and entertainment. Even now, we all seem surgically attached to our devices. And God forbid that our internet would go down during our lockdown. We even see the pursuit of pleasure in the church when people judge a service to be good, not because God's truth was faithfully proclaimed and enacted, but because they enjoyed it and it made them feel good. Now, the hedonism of our world should not come as a surprise to anyone. After all, this is the logical outcome of the human project started by Adam and Eve when they disobeyed God in order for them to be as God. They wanted to take the place of God in their lives, and this has been our mindset ever since. We who were created to glorify God and enjoy Him forever have curved in on ourselves. And therein lies the problem. Because we were created to find our pleasure in God, we will always find our pleasures unsatisfying because they will never be big enough to fill God's rightful place in our lives. And that's why there's an undercurrent of desperation in our pursuit of pleasure. We keep running after new and improved gadgets and obsess about self-improvement, be it in our looks, our careers, or our qualifications. Because we're hoping that if we could only have enough, or have the right thing, or be good enough, then our pleasures, whatever they might be, would finally meet our innermost cravings. But our pursuit only serves to distract us from the reality we refuse to admit. We are running after the wrong thing. So we need to hear the words of the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1 to 6. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. The time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give account to Him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel is preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the Spirit the way God does. Peter points believers back to Jesus' example of suffering, reminding them that they'd already spent enough time in debauched living. Instead of living to gratify our desires, Peter says, we need to live for the will of God. And this is not just external obedience to God. Like Jesus, we must live with a conscious commitment to glorify God in everything we do, making His purposes our purposes and delighting in what pleases God. Since God created us to glorify and enjoy Him, this is really the only way we can find life in all its fullness and meaning. But what is required is nothing less than the reversal of Adam and Eve's rebellion against God. Impossible, you say? Well, certainly with man it is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. Note that Peter begins this passage by telling us to have the same attitude that Jesus had. This is not simply a case of mind over matter. Underlying Peter's command is the understanding in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21 and 22, that believers have been united with Christ in His death and resurrection. Jesus died and rose again so that, in the words of 2 Corinthians 5:15, those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for Him who for their sake died and was raised. Living to do God's will is the result of having new hearts on which God's law is written. It is the life of the new creation. It is, therefore, the life that every believer should be living. But lest we think that living for the will of God is easy or that it guarantees a peaceful, easy existence, Peter also points out that to live for the will of God is to invite not simply the incredulous stares of our former partners in crime when we turn down their invitation to paint the town red. We also invite their hatred and slander. So why then would we want to live for God? Peter says that we should live for God regardless of the cost, because all men will have to give an account of their lives to the judge of the universe. It is ultimately the verdict of God that gives meaning and substance to our lives. That's why a believer can and must be willing to bear the suffering that following Christ entails, so that the tested genuineness of our faith may be found to result in praise, glory, and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. God's approval far outweighs any sacrifice we might have to bear. And here's the great thing. It's not that we have to earn God's approval somehow. We already have the approval of God because the righteousness of Jesus has been credited to us. So living to please God is an expression of our gratitude to Him for His marvelous grace that has guaranteed us an eternal, imperishable, unfading inheritance. Now, let's face it. Most of us probably would not struggle with the temptation to debauchery. After all, we're locked down. We can't do nothing like that. But we do struggle with a human passion to do as we please. Our current lockdown makes us chafe at having our freedom restricted. And that indicates our continuing struggle to live for the will of God and our misunderstanding of biblical freedom. Peter had previously told believers in chapter 2, verse 16, to live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. In other words, biblical freedom isn't the ability to do as we please. Rather, it is living under God's authority. It is the ability to live as God's slave, to live as one fully dedicated to fulfilling our Master's will. And it's the same freedom that Jesus enjoyed while He was here on earth. He delighted to do His Father's will, so He found pleasure in obedience. And that's how we must live. Living free begins with having our hearts reoriented to desire what pleases God, so that we delight to do His will. So let's use this time under lockdown to learn the freedom that comes from delighting in God. Therein lies genuine pleasure and enjoyment that glorifies God.